The fence was done. Every last post driven deep into the red Arizona earth, every last rail nailed tight and true, every last inch of that boundary line drawn between Sadie Bancroft's 40 acres and the rest of the world. Isaiah Ralston stood back and looked at what he had built, and the hollow feeling in his chest told him exactly what kind of fool he had been. He had built the fence she asked for. And now she was standing 20 feet away in the dry afternoon heat, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he had known her, her green eyes wet with something she was clearly fighting not to let fall, and she was asking him to stay, not to ride away. Not to take his tools and his horse and his dark past back down the trail toward Tucson or Yuma or any other place that would have a drifter with too many secrets and too few answers. She was asking him to build a life inside it. "You cannot ask me that," Isaiah said. His voice came out harder than he meant it, the words like stones thrown into still water. "You know what I am, Sadie. You know what follows me." "I know exactly what you are," she said. And she did not flinch, not even when his jaw tightened and his hand moved unconsciously to the place on his belt where a gun had lived for most of his adult life. "That is why I am asking." The Arizona sun was hammering the earth at 3:30 on a Thursday in October of 1883, and Isaiah Ralston stood in front of the most dangerous thing he had ever faced in 34 years of living hard and running harder. Not the fence. Not the 40 acres, not even the woman herself, though God knew she was terrifying in her own right. The dangerous thing was hope. And he had no idea yet how close they had both come to losing everything before a single nail had been driven, before a single word of love had been spoken, before the story of Isaiah Ralston and Sadie Bancroft had even truly begun. Let me tell you how they got there. 6 weeks earlier, in the last days of September 1883, the town of Colorado Crossing, Arizona Territory, was the kind of place that barely deserved the name town. It had a general store run by a widower named Holt Briggs who watered down his flour and made no apologies for it. It had a saloon called the Dusty Rail where men went to lose their wages and their dignity in roughly equal measure. It had a livery stable, a tiny Methodist church with a broken bell, a land office, and a telegraph station that was more often broken than not. And it had, sitting at the eastern edge of the jurisdiction, a 40-acre parcel of land with a small adobe house on it, a working well, and a woman who had just buried her father and inherited more trouble than she knew what to do with. Sadie Bancroft was 28 years old, which in 1883 in the Arizona Territory meant she was considered either admirably self-possessed or dangerously stubborn, depending on who you asked. She had come to Colorado Crossing 7 years earlier with her father, Gerald Bancroft, who had nursed a dream of raising cattle on his own land after a lifetime of working other men's ranches in Texas. Gerald had been a decent man and a hard worker, and the land had been good to him for a while, but the desert had its own opinions about durability, and in the end those opinions had won. Gerald Bancroft died in the second week of September 1883 of a fever that the nearest doctor, 40 miles away in Prescott, could not have helped even if he had been sitting in the room. He died owing a small debt to the bank in Prescott, owing a larger one to a man named Cotter Vane, and leaving Sadie alone with 40 acres of good grazing land, a small cattle herd of 18 animals, the adobe house, the well, and a problem that had been growing worse for the better part of 2 years. The problem had a name, and that name was Cotter Vane. Vane was what men in the territory called a land accumulator, which was a polite way of saying he was a predator who understood that the law, in 1883 in Arizona, was a flexible instrument that bent toward money and power with remarkable consistency. He had already absorbed 4 small properties along the Agua Fria Basin in the past 3 years, and he had made Gerald Bancroft loans at interest rates that Gerald, in his optimism, had believed he could manage. Gerald had been wrong, And now Cotter Vane wanted the 40 acres, and he was not a man who accepted the word no with any grace whatsoever. The morning after Gerald's burial, Vane had sent 2 of his men to the Bancroft property with a document he called a settlement offer, which was essentially an invitation for Sadie to sign away the deed in exchange for enough money to get herself to the nearest railway station, and nothing more. Sadie had read the document very carefully, set it down on the kitchen table with the same calm that people sometimes mistake for weakness, and told the 2 men to get off her land. She had a Winchester rifle she knew how to use. The men had left, but she knew they would come back. What Sadie needed, and she was clear-eyed enough to understand this even in the middle of her grief, was a boundary. Vane's cattle had been grazing onto her property for months, and while Gerald had complained and protested, he had never formalized the line. In 1883, in the territory, a property line that was not physically marked was a property line that was perpetually in dispute, and a disputed line was as good as no line at all in any conversation that might one day end up in front of a judge. Vane's lawyers would eat her alive on the argument of usage and encroachment if she did not have something physical and documented to point to. She needed a fence, a real one, posts and rails and clear visible evidence that this land ended here and her land began there. She did not have the money to hire a crew, and she did not have the strength to build 40 acres of fence line alone. She had the determination, but determination did not drive fence posts. She had placed a notice in the general store and at the saloon, looking for a fence builder willing to work for fair wages once the cattle were sold in November. She was offering good work and a square deal, and she meant every word of it. Isaiah Ralston had not been looking for fair wages. He had not, in fact, been looking for anything when he rode into Colorado Crossing on the 23rd of September, 1883. He had been looking for the opposite of something, which is to say he had been looking for a place to disappear for a while. He had ridden hard out of New Mexico territory after a situation in a town called Redemption Creek that had gone badly wrong, and not entirely through any fault of his own, though the distinction felt academic at certain hours of the night. There had been a man named Decker Frayne who had been a partner, and then a betrayer, and then something worse, and the aftermath of that betrayal had left Isaiah with a warrant outstanding in New Mexico that was based on a lie, but was nonetheless very real in its legal consequences. He was not a criminal in the way most people use that word. He had not murdered anyone. He had not robbed anyone. What he had done was survive, and survival in Isaiah Ralston's life had occasionally required him to operate in the gray country between what was strictly legal and what was necessary, and Decker Frayne had used that gray country against him with malice and precision. Isaiah was 34, tall, lean in the way of men who had never in their adult lives been certain of their next meal, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered oak. He had learned to build fences as a boy in West Texas because his father had believed that if a man could build a fence, he could always find work. And his father had been right about very little in life, but had been right about that. He had fencing skills and carpentry skills, and a quiet, methodical competence that people recognized and trusted even when they recognized and did not trust the man who possessed them. He had ridden into Colorado Crossing intending to rest his horse, buy some provisions, and ride out again before anyone had time to ask his name. And then he had seen the notice in the general store window. He almost kept walking. His hand was literally on the door of the general store when he read it, and the smarter part of his mind said clearly and firmly that this was not the moment to stay anywhere, that he needed to keep moving, that he was not the kind of man who could be trusted to do right by someone who needed right done. He went in anyway. Holt Briggs, the general store owner, looked at him the way that men in small towns looked at strangers, which was with equal parts suspicion and calculation, weighing the possibility of profit against the possibility of trouble. "The Bancroft notice," Isaiah said. "Is the woman serious?" Sadie Bancroft is always serious, Briggs said. Never met a woman more serious in my life. She buried her daddy 3 weeks ago and she has not stopped working since. She means what she says. What kind of wages? Briggs named a figure that was low but not insulting, and Isaiah did the arithmetic in his head. The cattle sale in November was roughly 6 weeks away, and by November the heat would be breaking and Colorado Crossing would have had 6 weeks to forget his face. And after November he could take his wages and ride north, maybe to Colorado or Wyoming, somewhere the reach of a New Mexico warrant was more likely to fray at the edges. 6 weeks. Build a fence. Collect wages. Disappear. That was the plan. That was the plan before he met Sadie Bancroft. He rode out to the property the same afternoon, and she came out of the adobe house to meet him while he was still tying his horse to the hitching post she had near the front door. She was wiping her hands on a work apron, and she looked at him with those green eyes in a direct, measuring way that reminded him of the way an experienced surveyor looks at land before deciding where to sink the first marker. "You are answering the notice," she said. It was not a question. "Isaiah Ralston, I do fence work and general carpentry." "Where from?" "West Texas, most recently New Mexico," he said, keeping it truthful while keeping it limited. She kept looking at him, and he had the unsettling sensation that she was reading things he had not said aloud. "You have a reason for being in Colorado Crossing other than the notice." "Passing through. The notice gave me a reason to stop." "Are you running from something?" He had not expected the question to be that direct, and he felt the trap spring in his chest, the familiar jerk of anxiety that came from being a man with things to hide talking to someone who seemed to see clearly. "Most people in the territory are running from something," he said carefully. "I am not running toward trouble if that is what you are asking." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not precisely what I was asking," she said, "but it will do for now." She looked past him at his horse, a gray roan that was road-worn but well cared for, and something in the condition of the horse seemed to settle something in her assessment of the man. "You treat your horse well." "Yes. The fence needs to run the full perimeter of the 40 acres. The south boundary is the one with the most urgency. Do you know why? Vane's cattle." She looked at him again with that sharp attention. "You have been in town less than a day. Men talk at the livery. A woman holding land alone against a man like Vane is the most interesting story in a town like this." I listened. He paused. "You should know the people in town are not all certain you can hold it." "I am aware of what people in town think," Sadie said. "What do you think?" He thought about it honestly. "I think you can hold it if you get the fence up before Vane decides to move more aggressively. A physical boundary changes the legal conversation." "Yes," she said. "It does." And then she nodded and he understood he was hired. The work began the next morning. Sadie had already ordered the lumber by wagon from Prescott, having made the arrangement before she had found someone to build the fence, which told him a great deal about her, and none of it was cautionary. The lumber was rough cedar, good for the purpose, and there were enough posts and rails already delivered that he could begin on the south boundary immediately. He started before sunrise and worked until the light was gone, and Sadie worked alongside him for the first 3 days. She did not romanticize the labor. She dug holes where he told her to dig, steadied posts while he drove them, handed him nails with a precision that told him she had done physical work all her life and had no illusions about what it cost. She did not talk while she worked, which he respected. But in the evenings, when he had set up a small camp at the edge of the property near the south pasture rather than riding back to town, she brought him supper without making a production of it, and they sat on opposite sides of the small fire and talked. It started with practical conversation. The cattle, which she had been managing alone since her father's decline. The water rights, which were the most valuable thing on the property and which Vane also wanted. The wire she was considering adding to the top rail of the fence once the structure was complete, to discourage casual trespass. The condition of the grazing grass after a dry summer. These were not romantic conversations. They were the conversations of two people with a shared immediate problem, working through it with intelligence and care. But something was happening underneath those conversations, and both of them felt it, and neither of them said anything about it. Isaiah caught himself looking at her more than was necessary. He noticed the way she moved, with an economy and purpose that was entirely unlike the performative grace women in towns were sometimes taught to affect. He noticed the way she spoke, with complete sentences and precise words, never wasting language on decoration. He noticed the way she handled the cattle when she checked on them each evening, with a patient firmness that the animals trusted immediately. He noticed the thin silver scar along her left forearm that she never explained and he never asked about. He noticed the small battered copy of a book she kept on the windowsill of the adobe house, which he eventually identified as a collection of poetry, which surprised him, and then, when he thought about it, did not surprise him at all. Sadie noticed things about him too, though she was more disciplined than he was about not letting herself dwell on them. She noticed that he worked with the absolute concentration of a man who had learned that careless work caused suffering. She noticed that he was gentle with her cattle when they wandered near him, which was not typical behavior for a man who had no stake in them. She noticed that he read the land the way experienced farmers read it, which meant he had roots somewhere, even if he was pretending not to have them. She noticed that he never talked about his past without looking briefly to the side, as if checking for something, and she understood from that small, involuntary motion that his past contained dangers he had not disclosed and was not sure he should. She should have been more cautious. She knew she should have been more cautious. Her father had been a good judge of character, and he had taught her to be one too, and the judgment she kept arriving at when she looked at Isaiah Ralston was that he was fundamentally a decent man who had been broken by something and was doing his best to work around the break without drawing attention to it. That was not a safe assessment to make about a stranger, but she kept arriving at it anyway. On the fifth evening, the conversation shifted. She had brought 2 cups of coffee out to the fire, which was the first time she had done so rather than just bringing food and going back inside. It was a small change, and they both knew what it meant, though neither acknowledged it. "You build fence beautifully," she said. "That is not a simple skill. My father thought it was the most important practical skill a man could have. He said a man who can build a good fence can always find honest work. He sounds like a man who thought carefully about things." He did. Isaiah turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "He died when I was 16. Fever, the same as your father." The parallel sat between them in the firelight. "I am sorry," Sadie said. "It was a long time ago." He looked at the fire. "What happened after was the making of whatever I am now, for better and worse." She understood he was giving her something without forcing the details, leaving the door open without forcing her through it. "Do you want to tell me about the worse?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. An owl moved in the darkness at the edge of the mesquite. The cattle shifted in the south pasture. "There was a man in New Mexico," he said finally. "A man named Decker Frayne. I trusted him when I should not have. The consequence of that trust is that I cannot go back to New Mexico territory, and the reason I cannot go back is unjust, but justice is not always the same as law." Sadie looked at him steadily. "What did he say you did?" "Robbery. A mining company payroll. I was in the vicinity. He was the one who planned it and carried it out, but I was there and I knew him and I did not stop it. That is the truth of it. I did not rob anyone, but I did not stop a robbery, and the warrant does not make that distinction." He had not planned to tell her. He had not planned to tell anyone. The words had simply come out of the firelight and the coffee and the quality of her attention, which was the most non-judgmental attention he had ever sat inside. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed too long in a bad situation with a man I should have left sooner. It is a common enough story." "It is," she agreed. "It does not make you a criminal. The warrant does." "The warrant makes you a legal inconvenience," she said dryly, and he found himself startled into something that was almost a laugh. "It does not tell me who you are. I have found that the law and character are frequently separate subjects in the territory. "You are remarkably composed about this. I have caught her Vane trying to take my land through legal manipulation," she said. "I understand perfectly well that the law is a tool and that tools can be misused. That does not shock me." He looked at her then with an openness that surprised him. He could not remember the last time he had said true things to someone and had not immediately regretted it. The fence building continued. By the end of the second week, the south boundary was complete, and it was solid work, straight and well-seated, the rails level and the posts driven deep enough to resist the ground heave that came with the temperature swings in the high desert. Sadie walked the entire south line the morning it was finished and touched each post as she went, and the satisfaction on her face was something Isaiah kept looking at when he thought she was not watching. Cotter Vane made his first appearance on the 14th day. He rode up to the property line in the early morning with 2 men behind him, his horse an expensive black gelding that was too fine for a working rancher, and perfectly appropriate for a man who thought of himself primarily as a businessman. Vane was perhaps 50, with the wide shoulders of a man who had once worked physically, and the softening belly of a man who had stopped. He had small eyes that were very attentive and a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to mean what it said some years ago. He looked at the new fence line along the south boundary for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Isaiah. "You are the fence builder," he said. "I am," Isaiah said. He had kept his voice completely flat and kept his hands visible, because he recognized the kind of man Vane was, and understood that visible hands made them feel in control, and feeling in control made them predictable. Vane looked at Sadie, who was standing at Isaiah's left, not behind him, beside him, and there was something in the geometry of that positioning that Vane registered and did not like. "Miss Bancroft, I would like to speak to you about the terms of our arrangement." "We do not have an arrangement," Sadie said. "We have a debt, which I am currently making arrangements to service through the November cattle sale. The terms of the loan are the terms your documents specify." The timeline your documents specify is November 30th. Today is October 7th. I am well within the timeline. Vane's jaw moved. He looked at the fence again, and Isaiah understood that Vane was recalculating something, that the fence was disrupting a plan that had assumed a lack of such a fence. The physical boundary complicated the legal strategy. That was exactly why Sadie needed it. "You are taking on additional expenses," Vane said carefully. "Hiring help. The fence materials. That suggests a degree of financial overextension that concerns me as your creditor." "My financial management is not your concern as my creditor," Sadie said. "Only the debt and its repayment are your concern, and I have addressed that concern. Is there anything else?" Vane looked at her for a moment with the flat patience of a man who is used to waiting for circumstances to change in his favor. "I am a patient man, Miss Bancroft." "Good day, Mr. Vane," she said. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, his 2 men following, and the silence he left behind was the tense kind that takes several minutes to soften. "He is going to try something else," Isaiah said. "Yes," Sadie agreed. "He is, but he is also a man who prefers legal mechanisms to direct confrontation. He will look for another angle before he tries anything more aggressive." She looked at the fence line. "Which is why we need to keep building." They kept building. The east boundary was next, then the north, then the long west line that ran closest to the Agua Fria Creek bed. Isaiah worked with increasing urgency as the weeks passed, because he understood now what was at stake, and because understanding what was at stake had transformed the job from work he was doing for wages into work he was doing for something else. Something he could not have named easily if anyone had asked him. He found himself thinking about Sadie during the working hours, which was not useful but was also unstoppable. He thought about the things she said in the evenings and the things she did not say. He thought about the direct, undeceived way she looked at the world, which he found simultaneously exhausting and more restful than anything he had ever known. He thought about the careful way she managed everything in her life, the cattle and the finances and the land and the threat from Vane, and the way that careful management did not come from fear, but from a deep, stubborn determination that this life she was building was worth protecting. He thought about all the reasons he should not be thinking about her at all. He had a warrant in New Mexico that was real even if it was unjust. He had the habits and the reflexes of a man who had been moving for a long time and had not built anything permanent for himself in years. He had the dark past that he had partially disclosed, and that had more texture and complication than one evening's conversation could hold. He was not a man who had the right to walk into someone else's carefully tended life and ask for a place in it. He thought about these things and kept building the fence. On the 18th day, there was an incident with the cattle. Sadie went out to check the south pasture in the morning and found 5 of her cattle gone. Not strayed, because the fence was solid. Gone, which meant the south gate had been opened in the night. She found the gate standing open and the tracks of horses heading south, toward Vane's land. She came and got Isaiah with her expression contained, and her eyes hot with the controlled anger of someone who is not going to panic, but is absolutely furious. They rode south together and found the 5 cattle in the eastern corner of a Vane holding pasture, mixed in with Vane's animals, and Sadie's brands clear on them, but also a fresh secondary brand that had been applied recently and clumsily. A thin smear of scar tissue over Sadie's mark that would not fool an experienced eye, but that would require an argument to explain. Brand confusion, Isaiah said quietly. He is building a case to claim they crossed the line and he absorbed them legally. With a fence now documented as clearly marking my boundary, Sadie said, he cannot claim they wandered across a disputed line. He can claim they were already on his side when the fence went up. It is a weaker argument, but without a lawyer to counter it. I will be in Prescott on Friday, she said immediately. The bank meeting about the loan extension is already scheduled. I will speak to an attorney while I am there. Sadie. He said her name for the first time without her family name, and they both paused at the sound of it. I can go with you. She looked at him. The offer was larger than its words, and they both knew it. We need to get the cattle back first, she said. They rode to Vane's main ranch house, which was an imposing structure of adobe and timber that made its statement about land and power without subtlety. Vane was not there, but his foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Teague, came out to meet them with the resigned look of someone who knows this conversation is going to be unpleasant. Sadie did not raise her voice. She told Teague that 5 of her animals were in his pasture, that they bore her brand, that the secondary mark was recent and would be identified as recent by anyone competent to examine it, and that she was taking them back across the fence line this morning. She told him to tell Vane that if her property was trespassed on again, she would be speaking to the territorial marshal and to a Prescott attorney both. Teague looked at Isaiah the entire time Sadie was speaking, in the way that men in the territory sometimes made clear that they considered a physical man to be the relevant conversational party, regardless of who was actually talking. Isaiah said nothing and kept his expression utterly neutral, because the most powerful message he could send in that moment was that Sadie's authority required no augmentation from him. They brought the cattle back. That evening, sitting by the fire with the feeling of the day's confrontation still in the air, Sadie said something that she said quietly and directly, and with the honesty that was becoming the most unmistakable thing about her. Isaiah, she said, why are you still here? He turned to look at her. You have been here nearly 3 weeks, she said. The wages I can offer you are not exceptional. The situation has become complicated and potentially dangerous. You have reasons of your own to stay invisible. Why have you not ridden on? He had thought about that exact question several times. He had honest answers to it, and he had been avoiding them because honest answers have consequences. The fence is not finished, he said. It will be finished in 10 days at this pace. That is not why you are still here, and you know it. He did know it. No, he said. It is not. She waited. I find that I care what happens to this place, he said carefully. I find that I care what happens to you. I have been trying not to, because I understand that I am not a man who has the right to care about those things in the way that I do." He looked at the fire. "That is the truthful answer." Sadie was quiet for long enough that he began to think he had miscalculated entirely, that he had read the friendship and the professional respect and the mutual honesty as something they were not, that he had made the situation worse by speaking. "What does it mean," she said finally, "to not have the right to care about something?" "It means I cannot offer you anything permanent. My situation does not allow, Isaiah." She said his name with the same level directness she used for everything. "I am not asking you to offer me anything. I am asking you to tell me the truth. The rights and the offerings can wait." He looked at her then in the firelight, with the desert quiet around them and the cattle moving softly in the pasture and the fence he had been building standing solid in the dark, and he told her the truth. "I have not felt at home anywhere in nearly 10 years, he said. "I have been moving because moving is how I have managed to survive, and because I stopped believing that home was something I was allowed to want. And then I rode in here, and I built this fence, and I sat with you in the evenings, and I realized that I have not wanted to ride out at sunrise for the first time in a very long time. That is the truth." Sadie looked at him for a moment in the shifting firelight. "That is a good truth," she said quietly. "I wanted you to know that." She went inside. He sat by the fire for another hour, and the hollow place in his chest that had been there so long he had stopped feeling it was conspicuous now by its absence. The trip to Prescott was in 3 days, and those 3 days passed with a different quality than the days before. Not changed in the work, which was as intense as ever with the fence nearly complete, but changed in the air between them. Something had been said that could not be unsaid, and while nothing had been resolved and everything was still complicated and dangerous and full of obstacles, the things that were complicated and dangerous were being navigated by 2 people who were no longer pretending they were something less than what they were to each other. They rode to Prescott together on a Friday, 40 miles on good horses in the early morning cool. The ride took most of the morning, and they talked for most of it, not about Vane and not about fences, but about the other things, the accumulated small history of their lives that people share when they are beginning to understand that another person's past is their own future landscape. She told him about growing up in East Texas with her father and no mother, her mother having died when Sadie was 4 of a post-birth fever after a younger sibling who had not survived. She told him about teaching herself to read from her father's Bible, and then from every book she could find, because in the absence of schooling she had made her own education out of whatever was available, and had found the process mostly satisfying. She told him about the decision to come to Arizona Territory, which had been as much hers as her father's, because she had understood at 21 that the life available to her in East Texas was a very small life, and she had not been willing to accept small. He told her more about his West Texas childhood, the fence-building father who had been gentle and competent and unsuccessful in the ways that mattered to creditors, the early years after his father's death when he had worked whatever work would have him, the gradual development of the skills that had kept him fed and moving. He told her about Decker Frayne with more detail than he had before, about how the partnership had begun as a legitimate freighting operation and had darkened by slow degrees until Isaiah had been deep enough in the gray country that extricating himself had required choices he was not proud of. He told her about the night of the robbery, the way he had stood outside the locked mining office while Frayne was inside, knowing what was happening, unable to make himself either stop it or walk away, the worst kind of paralysis, the kind that comes from not having decided who you are yet. "And now," she asked, "have you decided?" "I am still deciding," he said. "I think that is always the answer if you are honest. You are always still deciding." "Yes," she said, "but the decisions accumulate. They make a shape." "What shape do you think mine is making?" She considered it. "A man who knows how to build things that last," she said, "and who is learning to believe he is allowed to." They reached Prescott in the early afternoon, a real town of several thousand people in 1883. the territorial capital at the time, with proper streets and a courthouse and lawyers' offices, and the bank on Montezuma Street where Sadie needed to conduct her business. They separated there, Sadie to the bank, and then to an attorney's office she had identified through the bank, and Isaiah to the general stores for supplies, though he went first and quickly to the telegraph office, because there was something he needed to know. He sent a telegram to a man named Calhoun Reeves in El Paso, a former lawman he had done honest work with years before, and who had enough connections in the territory to ask questions quietly. The telegram asked about the current status of the warrant in New Mexico and whether there were any legal mechanisms to challenge it that had not been explored. He sent it and tried not to think about it and went and bought nails and a new draw knife, because the old one had cracked its handle and could not be relied upon. He met Sadie at the hotel where they had agreed to have a late lunch, and she was sitting at the table with the look of someone who has just had a long and important conversation and is still processing its implications. "The attorney's name is Hargrove," she said. "He knows Vane. He says Vane has done this before, specifically this brand confusion strategy. He says there is case precedent in the territory that it can be countered if the fence is properly documented with witnesses to the original boundary survey. Can you get the witnesses? The original survey was done by a man named Pell. He still lives outside of Colorado Crossing. He is willing to testify to the line as he surveyed it, which predates Vane's cattle encroachment by 4 years. She unfolded a piece of paper. And Hargrove says the most important thing I can do is complete the fence and document it with the land office. A completed, witnessed, land office registered fence along the original survey line makes Vane's brand confusion strategy legally almost indefensible. The fence will be done in 10 days, Isaiah said. Hargrove says he will come to Colorado Crossing himself to file the documentation when it is complete. He is interested in this case because he says Vane has been operating in this fashion long enough that someone needs to make it expensive for him. "You have a real advocate," Isaiah said, and the relief he felt was enormous, and he did not bother to hide it. She looked at him across the table. "You are relieved." "Of course I am relieved. This is not your fight, Isaiah." "I know it is not my fight," he said. "I am relieved anyway." She held his look for a moment, and then she smiled, which was the first full, unguarded smile he had seen from her, and it was the kind of smile that reorganized the landscape of everything around it. They rode back to Colorado Crossing the next morning. The last 10 days of fence building were different from the first days. He could not have described precisely how they were different, except that the air between them had changed again, and this time the change was warmer and more complicated, and he was no longer even attempting to maintain the professional distance that he had been holding on to as a courtesy to both of them and a protection for himself. She began to tell him small things, the kind of small things that people only tell each other when they have stopped calculating the risk of disclosure. She told him that she hated the silence after dark in the desert, not because she was afraid of it, but because it was too big and she had been filling it alone for too long. She told him that her father had always wanted grandchildren, and that the weight of being the only surviving Bancroft had a specific quality that she could not quite name, but that she felt most strongly on Sunday mornings. She told him that the poetry book on her windowsill had been a gift from a friend she had lost track of years ago, and that she kept it not because she read it often, but because it proved that someone had once thought her worth giving books to. He told her that he had thought about settling, many times, about finding a piece of land and staying, but that the warrant in New Mexico had always provided a reason not to, because a man with a warrant could not afford to become known, could not afford to have his name on a deed, could not afford to be findable. He told her that he was not sure what he would do if the warrant could somehow be resolved. He told her that he was beginning to think about it in concrete terms for the first time in years, which was terrifying in the way that hope is always terrifying. She listened to all of it. She did not offer false reassurance or premature resolution. She just listened, which was the most valuable thing she could have done. On the 27th day of October, 1883, Isaiah Ralston drove the last rail of the last section of the fence, the northwest corner of the west boundary, and the fence was complete. He stood back and looked at it. 40 acres of cedar fence, properly posted and railed, standing clean and definitive in the late afternoon light. The boundary line of the Bancroft property, marked with absolute physical certainty against any argument or encroachment or legal manipulation that Cotter Vane or anyone else might attempt. He had built it. Sadie came to stand beside him, and she was quiet for a long time, looking at what he had made for her, and the quality of her silence was something he felt in his chest, the way you feel the first sign of a weather change, something large and significant moving toward you. "It is perfect," she said. "It is solid," he said, "which is better than perfect." She turned to look at him, and the light was the late copper light of October in Arizona, and she looked at him with the full, direct, unhidden attention that she had been giving him in pieces for a month, and this time she was giving it all at once. "Isaiah," she said, "what happens now?" He understood the question. It was the question he had been standing next to for 10 days, aware of it the way you are aware of a drop-off at the edge of a path, knowing it is there, moving carefully near it, not yet certain whether you are going to step back from it or go over it. "I collect my wages," he said, which was the honest and cowardly answer, the answer that kept all the doors open by going through none of them. She did not look away. "I am not asking about wages." He was quiet. "I am asking what you want to do," she said. "Not what you believe you are allowed to do, or what your situation makes practical. What do you want?" He looked at the fence, and then at the 40 acres it enclosed, and then at the woman standing beside him with green eyes and a direct question, and the kind of steadiness that you spend your whole life looking for without knowing you are looking for it. "I want to stay," he said. "Then stay," she said. It was that simple and that complicated. He did not reach for her. She did not reach for him. But something was decided in that exchange that was as solid and permanent as the fence he had just finished, and they both knew it. The attorney Hargrove arrived from Prescott 4 days later, on the 31st of October, accompanied by the surveyor Pell, and the three of them walked the entire fence line while Hargrove made his measurements and his notes, and Pell confirmed the coincidence of the fence with the original survey with the kind of calm professional certainty that would hold up in any court in the territory. Hargrove filed the documentation at the Colorado Crossing Land Office the same afternoon. The fence was on the record. The boundary was legally unambiguous. Cotter Vane made a final attempt. He came himself this time, without the two men, just himself and his fine black horse, on the 2nd of November. He came in the early morning while the air was still cold, and Sadie was at the well, and Isaiah was working on the gate hinges on the south entry, which had developed a slight sag that he wanted to address before he could in good conscience call the work entirely done. Vane dismounted at the south fence line and stood looking at the documentation notice that Hargrove had affixed to the main south post, a legal document with the land office seal, and his face went through several changes in the space of about 30 seconds. Then he looked at Isaiah. "You have made a career decision that may prove unwise," Vane said. Isaiah set down his tools. He kept his voice level. "I have built a fence on legal property along a legal survey line for a property owner who asked for it. That seems like a straightforward career decision." Vane's eyes moved to Sadie, who had come from the well and was standing at the near edge of the south pasture. "Miss Bancroft, you are making this more complicated than it needs to be." "No," Sadie said clearly. "I am making it exactly as complicated as it needs to be, no more and no less." Vane looked at the documented fence post for another moment. He was a man who moved on calculation, and Isaiah could see him running the calculation right now, weighing the cost of further legal action against an attorney-backed documented boundary against the benefit of the 40 acres, and arriving at an answer that was not the one he had expected when he first made Gerald Bancroft that loan. "The loan will be repaid in full at the November sale," Sadie said. "If you have no further legitimate business here, I would ask you to leave my property." Vane left. He did not come back. The cattle sale in Prescott on the 20th of November was solid. Sadie sold 14 of the 18 cattle, keeping 4 breeding stock for the following year, and the price was fair. She repaid the loan to Vane's bank agent in Prescott with full documentation and kept a copy of the receipt, as Hargrove had advised. She paid Isaiah his wages, the full amount agreed upon, and a small additional sum that she pressed into his hand without ceremony, and said represented the difference between the work she had advertised and the work he had actually done. He stood in the Prescott Hotel lobby with the money in his hand and felt the specific discomfort of a man whose next move is completely open. He had wages. He had the horse. He had no fence left to build and no contract left to fulfill. He had a response waiting for him at the telegraph office from Calhoun Reeves in El Paso, which he had not yet collected, and the anticipation of that response sat in his stomach like a stone. He collected it. Reeves had written carefully, in the telegraphic shorthand of the period. The warrant in New Mexico was contested. Decker Frayne had been arrested 2 months ago in Colorado for a subsequent robbery, a robbery he had conducted alone and without any ambiguity about authorship, and the arresting marshal had noted in his report the possibility that previous charges in New Mexico might require re-examination. The warrant against Isaiah was still technically active, but was, according to Reeves, unlikely to be prosecuted given the changed circumstances, particularly if Isaiah were willing to make a voluntary statement regarding the original incident, which Reeves offered to help arrange through his connections in the New Mexico marshal's office. It was not a full resolution. It was an opening. It was more than he had believed possible 6 weeks ago. He went back to Colorado Crossing. He had not told Sadie he was going back. He had not told anyone. He simply rode back, arriving at the Bancroft property on the 23rd of November in the early afternoon, and she was at the south gate when he came up the trail, as if she had known, and perhaps she had known, or perhaps she had simply been at the south gate out of habit and the timing was what it was. She looked at him on his road-worn horse with his tools on the pack behind the saddle, and she said, "I was not certain you were coming back." "I was not certain either," he said honestly. "But I did not go far. I collected a telegram in Prescott. The situation in New Mexico is changing." He dismounted and stood in front of her and told her about Frayne's arrest and Reeves's message and the possibility, not certain but real, of the warrant being cleared. She listened to all of it with her hands folded and her green eyes steady on his. "What does that mean for you?" she said when he finished. "It means that the primary obstacle to my staying anywhere permanently, with my name on a deed, as a known person with a known address, may be removing itself." He looked at her. "Which raises a question I have been trying to find the courage to ask you since I drove the last post." Sadie was completely still. "I built the fence you asked for," he said. "The 40 acres are your own, secured and documented. You do not need me for that anymore, but I find myself—" He stopped and started again because this was the most important sentence he had said in his life and he wanted it to be right. "I find myself wondering if you might have use for me in another capacity. A permanent capacity, a capacity that would require me to build something else entirely, something inside the fence." She looked at him for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" she said, with the very careful neutrality of someone who is not going to make assumptions. "A life," he said, "with you if you are willing. A house properly built because the adobe is too small for 2 people and needs a real addition. A larger cattle operation because the land can support it. A future, which is a word I have not used in 10 years because I had not believed it was available to me." He paused. "And marriage if you will have me. I am asking you to marry me, Sadie. That is the question I have been working up to." The silence that followed was the desert silence she had described to him, the one that was too big to fill alone, and she stood inside it for what felt to him like a very long time. "You understand," she said finally, "that I am not a simple undertaking. I know that. This land is my life, and I will not subordinate it to anyone, not even someone I love." The word landed between them without drama and without apology, and he felt it with the totality of a man who has been hungry for a long time and has just been offered a meal. "I know that too," he said, "and you have a complicated past that is not entirely resolved and may require attention in New Mexico at some point." "Yes. And you have been a drifting man for a very long time, which means that staying will require a deliberate choice made repeatedly, not just once." "Yes, I understand that." She looked at him with the full green directness of her. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Isaiah Ralston, I will marry you, and you had better build a very good addition to that house because you are right that it is too small." He stepped forward and took her hands, which were calloused from work and warm from the November sun, and he held them in his and looked at her face and felt the thing he had been afraid of feeling, the terrible specific vulnerability of loving something you cannot afford to lose. "I will build it properly," he said. "Posts sunk deep. Good materials. Meant to last." "I know," she said. "I have seen your work." And she stepped forward and kissed him, briefly and directly, the way she did everything, and the 40 acres of Arizona territory were very bright in the late November sun around them. The weeks that followed were the most demanding and the most alive that Isaiah had experienced in his adult life. The demands were real and numerous. He began the correspondence with Calhoun Reeves in El Paso regarding the warrant, a process that required written statements and legal filings and patience. The legal machinery moving at the pace legal machinery always moves, which is to say slower than anyone wants it to. He began work on the house addition, which he designed with Sadie over 2 evenings at the kitchen table. The two of them bent over paper with a pencil and a lamp, arguing pleasantly about window placement and room proportions, with the focused engagement of two people who have discovered that arguing pleasantly with each other is one of the better things life has to offer. The addition was to be 2 rooms, a proper bedroom to replace the one in the original adobe, which was too small and poorly lit, and a larger front room for living and eating and working that would give the house the scale a working homestead needed. He was building it with proper lumber, ordered again from Prescott, and with a stone foundation that would last longer than either of them. He proposed formally to Reverend Aldous at the Methodist Church in Colorado Crossing, who was a spare, kind man who had seen a great many frontier marriages and knew enough to ask only the questions that mattered. He asked if the marriage was free and willing on both sides. He asked about the residence, which he verified against the land office record. He agreed to perform the ceremony on the 15th of December, which gave them 3 weeks. Sadie wrote a letter to her father's sister in East Texas, an aunt named Clara who had been her closest remaining family connection, telling her about the marriage and the property and the fence and Isaiah in that order, which said something about her priorities that Isaiah found deeply amusing when she showed him the letter before sending it. "You put the fence before me," he pointed out. "The fence was chronologically prior," she said. "You are a very literal woman." "You knew that before you proposed," she said. He loved it. The days between the proposal and the wedding were full of work, the house construction and the cattle management, and the continued correspondence with Reeves. And they were also full of a particular kind of aliveness that Isaiah associated entirely with Sadie's presence in his daily existence. She had opinions about everything, about how the window frame should be seated, about the best grass management for the south pasture going into winter, about the character of the new deputy in Colorado Crossing who had replaced the previous one who had been indifferent at best about Vane's encroachments, about the future of the territory as it moved toward statehood. She shared these opinions without apology or performance, and he shared his back, and the conversation between them was the most continuous and the most genuinely mutual conversation he had ever been part of. He also noticed, with a particular and tender attentiveness, that she was beginning to relax. The vigilance that she had been wearing since before he had arrived, the constant alertness of a woman alone managing a threatened property, was loosening, not disappearing. She was too clear-eyed for naivety, but becoming less constant, less the whole shape of her presence and more one element of a larger wholeness. She laughed more often. She slept, she told him once, better than she had in over a year. She stood at the fence line in the mornings sometimes and looked out at the territory with an expression that was less like a sentry and more like a landowner who trusted what she had built. He was building a good addition. He had not told her about the specific detail of his dark past that he had held back, the part that went beyond Decker Frayne and the robbery, the earlier years in his 20s, when he had worked as an enforcer for a freighting company in Colorado that had used methods he had not always approved of, and had sometimes carried out anyway, because he had been young and poor, and not yet clear about who he intended to be. He had not done lasting harm to anyone, but he had done things he was ashamed of, and the shame was specific and present even when its source was 12 years in the past. He told her. He told her on the 10th of December, 5 days before the wedding, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them and the desert quiet outside. He told her all of it, the Colorado years, the specific incidents, the choices he had made from poverty and unclear character, and the willingness at that time to defer his integrity in exchange for wages. He told her without minimizing and without dramatizing, just the plain accounting of a man who had decided that the person he was building a life with was owed the full inventory of what they were building it with. She listened without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because in 5 days you are going to marry me, and because I want the person you are marrying to be the actual person." She looked at him. "Do you think this changes my answer?" "I do not know," he said honestly. "I know that people have the right to make their choices with full information." She folded her hands on the table. "Isaiah, you are describing a young man who made wrong choices in poverty and came to be ashamed of them and spent years afterward trying to become someone different." She looked at him steadily. "I am not marrying the 22-year-old who took wages he should not have. I am marrying the man who drove fence posts into the hard ground of my land to protect what I had built, who told me the truth when it cost him something, and who is telling me this now because he cannot bear the idea of beginning a marriage on incomplete honesty." He was very still. "The answer is still yes," she said. "That is final." He put his hands over hers on the table, and neither of them moved for a long time. The 15th of December, 1883, was a cold, bright day. The sky the hard winter blue of the high desert, the air sharp with the smell of juniper from the hills to the north. The Methodist church in Colorado Crossing was small and drafty, and the bell was still broken, but Reverend Aldous had put evergreen branches at the window ledges, and there were perhaps 30 people in the pews. The accumulated connections of Sadie's 7 years in the territory, neighbors and the general store owner Briggs and the new deputy and the surveyor Pell, and Hargrove the attorney who had come down from Prescott for the occasion, and Holt Briggs's wife who had been unexpectedly kind to Sadie since the news of the wedding had spread, and a scattering of others who had been watching the story of Sadie Bancroft and the fence and the stranger who had built it and were glad to see it come to this. Sadie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric sent from Prescott, deep green wool that was warm and practical, and that she wore with the same uprightness she wore everything. And Isaiah stood at the front of the church in a new shirt and his best coat, which was not impressive by city standards but was the best he had. And when she came up the aisle, he looked at her the way he had been trying not to look at her for weeks, with everything visible at once. And she looked back at him with the same directness and openness that meant more to him than any declaration. Reverend Aldous said the words. They said the words. Isaiah Ralston and Sadie Bancroft, and then Sadie Ralston. though she kept Bancroft on the land deed because it was her father's name and the land was her father's dream, and that mattered. And Isaiah understood and approved completely. Briggs's wife had made a cake with dried fruit and actual sugar, which was a real extravagance in Colorado Crossing in 1883. And there was a fiddler named Jessup who played 3 songs while people ate and talked. And Isaiah danced with his wife for the first time to a song Jessup played called Sweet Betsy from Pike, which was not a particularly romantic song, but was what Jessup knew, and they danced to it anyway with the particular grace of 2 people who are not thinking about the dancing. They drove home to the 40 acres in the last of the afternoon light. The house addition was not yet fully finished inside. The walls still needed their final plaster coat, and the bedroom floor needed one more day of work. But the structure was sound, and the roof was on, and the new front room had a fireplace that drew well and a window with a proper frame that looked out over the south pasture and the fence line beyond. Sadie stood in the new front room and looked out the window at the fence in the evening light, and he stood behind her and looked at the same thing, the cedar posts and rails running clean and straight across the red earth, holding the boundary of what was theirs. "We live here now," she said. "We live here," he agreed. It was very simple and very complete. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was spent in the particular deep engagement of 2 people building a shared life from its components. There was the physical work, the house completion, and the cattle management, and the fence maintenance, and the accumulated infrastructure of a working homestead in the territory. There was the organizational work, the combining of what had been separate into what was shared, her savings and his wages, her plans and his skills, her knowledge of the land and his knowledge of building things that lasted. And there was the ongoing and endlessly interesting work of knowing each other better, which they undertook with the same directness and attention they brought to everything. Isaiah made good on his promise to be deliberate about staying. There were mornings, he admitted to her once, when the old reflex still fired, the one that said movement was safety and staying was exposure. He had it understood and identified, and he dealt with it by going outside and looking at the fence until it passed. And then he came back inside and made coffee, and she did not ask him about it because she had watched from the window and understood. She had her own difficult things, which she had not disclosed at the same rate he had, but which came out in the winter evenings. The grief for her father, which was deeper and more complex than her practical manner in the weeks after his death had suggested. The loneliness of the years in the territory that she had managed so successfully that it had become invisible even to herself. The specific fear that had lived in her since Vane's first visit, and that had not entirely departed even after his last one. She told him these things, and he received them the way she had received his, without minimizing and without fixing, just with the solid presence of a person who is genuinely there. The response from New Mexico came in February. Calhoun Reeves had been as good as his word. Decker Frayne, in exchange for considerations in his Colorado case, had given a statement to the New Mexico Marshal's office that confirmed Isaiah's account of the night of the robbery, his presence but not his participation, his failure to stop it but not his involvement in planning or execution. The warrant was officially vacated on the 14th of February, 1884, and the documentation arrived at the Colorado Crossing Telegraph Office on the 22nd. Isaiah read it 3 times standing in the street outside the telegraph office, in the cold February morning, the paper in his hand. Then he rode home and gave it to Sadie. She read it once, she looked at him, and then she did something she had never done before. She put her arms around him and held on, and he stood in the middle of their new front room and held his wife and felt the specific and complete release of a man who has been carrying a weight so long that he had incorporated it into his sense of himself, and now did not know what he was without it. "It is over," she said into his shoulder. "It is over," he said. He cried a little, which surprised him. She did not comment on it. She held him tighter. The spring of 1884 brought new cattle, 4 additional animals purchased at a fair price from a Prescott rancher who was downscaling, and the Bancroft Ralston herd grew to a working size that made the 40 acres justify itself fully. Isaiah built a proper barn that spring, cedar again and properly jointed, with stalls for the horses and a hay storage section that was dry and ventilated correctly. He built it with the same methodical care he had brought to the fence, and Sadie painted the doors a dark red that she had wanted since she first read about Eastern barns in a catalog from back home, and the red doors against the adobe and the cedar and the red earth of the territory were exactly right. In April, Hargrove wrote from Prescott with news about Cotter Vane. Vane had been the subject of a formal investigation by the Territorial Land Commission regarding his acquisition practices, an investigation that had been made possible in part by the documented case of his attempted encroachment on the Bancroft property, which Hargrove had submitted as evidence. Vane had not been prosecuted, the territory's legal mechanisms being what they were in 1884, but the investigation had made his future land acquisitions considerably more complicated and had required him to quietly reverse one of his earlier absorptions when the original owner produced documentation of their own. It was not the full justice the situation deserved, but it was something real. Sadie read Hargrove's letter at the kitchen table and then put it down and looked out the window at the fence line and the cattle beyond it. "My father would have been pleased," she said. "Yes," Isaiah said, "he would." The summer of 1884 was hot and full and demanding and alive. Isaiah had become a known man in Colorado Crossing by now, known with the specific quality of respect that comes to a man who has shown up and done good work, and meant what he said in a place where too many people were neither showing up nor meaning what they said. The deputy, whose name was Cray, consulted him occasionally about fence-related property disputes that arose in the territory around the town, which were frequent and often contentious, and Isaiah's knowledge and his calm made him a useful informal resource. He was not looking for a reputation or a public role, but the reputation arrived anyway, the way good things sometimes do when you are not performing for them. And in October of 1884, 1 year after the fence was completed, Sadie told him she was expecting. She told him in the evening, at the kitchen table, which was where they had all their important conversations, in the lamplight with the coffee cups and the desert outside, the same way they had told each other every true thing. "The baby will be born in the spring," she said. "Around April, I think." He looked at her with the full force of what he felt, which was too large to put in a single expression, and which she saw anyway in all its largeness. "Are you well?" he asked, which was not the first thing he had imagined saying in this moment, but was in fact the right thing to say. "I am well," she said, tired in a new way, but well. He took her hand. A spring baby, she agreed. "The timing is good for the cattle schedule," he laughed, which was the best response he had. "You are thinking about the cattle schedule. Someone has to." "I love you," he said, which was something he said regularly and meant entirely every time. "I love you too," she said, "cattle schedule and all." The pregnancy proceeded through the winter with the health and the mild complications that were normal in 1883 terms for a woman of 29 in good general condition in the territory. There was no doctor closer than Prescott, which was the consistent fact of life in Colorado Crossing, but there was a midwife named Rosalind Fair who had attended perhaps 60 territory births and who Sadie trusted, and Isaiah did not pretend to himself that he was not frightened about the birth because he was, deeply, with the specific and unmanageable fear of a man who loves someone completely and understands the risks clearly. He poured the fear into work. He built a proper cradle from smooth cedar, jointed and sanded to a finish that had no rough places anywhere because he was not willing for his child to encounter rough places, not even small ones. He reinforced the bedroom window frame for better insulation against the winter cold. He made sure the water supply was solid and the firewood was stacked higher than strictly necessary. He was a man building things, which was what he did with everything that mattered. Sadie watched him build the cradle one afternoon and did not say anything for a long time, and then she said, "You are going to be an extraordinary father." He looked up from his work. "You build things to last," she said. "You pay attention to the details that matter. You are not afraid to begin again when something needs to be redone. Those are exactly the qualities that matter most." He was very quiet for a moment. "I did not have much of a model. I know. Neither did I, not for everything." She looked at him steadily. "But we are both people who learn. That is the most important quality of all." On the 2nd of April, 1885, after a labor that Rosalind Fair managed with calm efficiency, and that lasted 12 hours, Sadie gave birth to a son. Isaiah was outside for most of the labor because Rosalind had a firm policy about that and Sadie had backed her up. And he had spent 12 hours outside his own house, alternately doing unnecessary maintenance on the south gate and sitting on the fence rail watching the Arizona night, praying in the directionless way of a man who is not sure about God, but is certain that something larger than himself is involved in this moment. When Rosalind opened the door and said, "Come in," he went in, and Sadie was in the bed looking exhausted and entirely herself, and there was a baby in her arms. A son, a boy. Small and red and complete, with a faint dark fuzz of hair and Sadie's straight nose and eyes that had not decided their color yet and would decide in the weeks to come, on the weathered oak brown of his father's. Isaiah Ralston sat beside his wife on the bed and looked at his son, and the feeling was not like anything he had a name for, so he did not try to name it. "He needs a name," Sadie said. "What were you thinking?" He asked because he had deliberately not pressed a preference, understanding that this was her body's work and her choice should lead. "Gerald," she said, "for my father, and James for yours if that is all right." "My father's name was James," he said. "I know. You told me last winter." "Gerald James Ralston," he said. "Yes." He held his son for the first time very carefully, with the particular care of a man who has spent his life building things that have to last, and Gerald James Ralston looked up at him with the unfocused but attentive expression of the newborn, and something in Isaiah settled into place that had been waiting to settle for 34 years. The spring and summer of 1885 were full in a new way, with the fullness of 3 people in a house that was now the right size, with the particular love that grows in the space between 2 adults who are discovering together what they are like as parents, which is always different from what you expected and usually better in the ways that matter. Gerald was a solid baby, good-natured and curious, and Sadie mothered him with the same clear-eyed competence she brought to everything. And Isaiah walked the floor with him in the early morning hours and sang him songs he barely remembered from his own childhood and made up the words when he could not remember the originals. The cattle operation expanded again that fall. Isaiah had been trading fence building work and carpentry expertise with 2 neighboring homesteaders in exchange for assistance with the herd, and the informal exchange had formalized into a small cooperative arrangement that was good for all 3 properties. The territory in 1885 was changing. More settlers, more infrastructure, the railway pushing closer to Prescott, the legal framework for property rights becoming more robust, and the 40 acres that had been under threat 2 years ago were now a secure and productive component of a small but real agricultural community. Cotter Vane had sold his main holding in the fall of 1885 and departed the area, reportedly headed to California, where presumably there were other properties and other vulnerable owners for him to target. His departure from the district was not mourned by anyone Isaiah or Sadie spoke to. Reverend Aldous finally fixed the church bell in the spring of 1886, and the first time it rang properly, clear and clean across the town, Sadie stopped what she was doing at the fence line where she was checking the cedar for winter weather wear, and listened to it, and smiled. Gerald was walking by then, a determined and slightly stumbling upright passage from one fixed object to another that delighted his parents completely every single time. He had his father's straight bearing and his mother's refusal to be discouraged by setbacks, and the combination produced a child who fell down, looked at the floor with the mildly indignant expression of someone noting an error in the world, and got back up immediately to try again. Isaiah had written to his former partner Calhoun Reeves in El Paso, thanking him for the work on the warrant and giving him the address of the Bancroft Ralston property as a permanent address, which was the first time in over a decade that Isaiah had given anyone a permanent address. Reeves had written back warmly and had sent a small christening gift for Gerald that arrived 6 months after Gerald's birth because the mail service in the territory was what it was. On a warm September evening in 1886, 3 years after Isaiah had ridden into Colorado Crossing and read the notice in Briggs's general store window, he and Sadie sat on the new porch he had built along the front of the expanded adobe house, which now had the porch and 2 additions and proper wood floors and a second fireplace, and all the marks of a house that someone had been thinking about and improving with sustained attention. Gerald was asleep inside. The cattle were in the south pasture. The fence ran clean and definitive around all 40 acres, the cedar weathering to a silver gray now, but no less solid for it. "Do you remember what you said the day you finished the fence?" Sadie asked. "I said many things. You said you could not offer me anything permanent." He thought about it. "I said my situation did not allow it." "And what does your situation allow now?" she asked, with the slight curve at the corner of her mouth that meant she was being pleased and precise at the same time. He looked out at the fence line and the property it enclosed, the barn with the red doors, the cattle moving quietly in the fall evening, the well that had given good water for 3 years of his tenure on this land. He thought about the warrant that was gone and the past that was real but no longer a threat, and the permanent address he had given Reeves, and the cradle he had built, and the son in it, and the woman beside him. "Everything," he said. "My situation allows everything." She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable and permanent silence of 2 people who had said most of the important things, and did not need to fill the air with words to be close to each other. The desert evening settled around the 40 acres, the light going from copper to rose to the deep blue of the high-altitude dusk, and the first star appeared above the Agua Fria hills, and Isaiah Ralston looked at the fence he had built, and the life inside it, and felt, for the first time and completely, that he was home. In the spring of 1887, Sadie told him she was expecting again. This time he was not frightened in the same way, or rather, he was frightened, but it was familiar now, the specific fear that is the shadow side of loving people, and he had learned to carry it and work alongside it. The second baby was born in November of 1887, a girl this time, delivered again by Rosalind Fair with the same efficient calm. They named her Clara, for Sadie's aunt in East Texas who had come to visit in the summer and stayed 6 weeks, and had been an unexpected and complete delight. A small, fierce woman in her 60s who had approved of Isaiah so thoroughly that he had felt the approval like a physical warmth. Gerald was fascinated by his sister. He stood at the cradle edge, which Isaiah had widened slightly for the new baby while maintaining the same careful, smooth finish, and looked at Clara with the intent focus of a 2.5-year-old encountering something significantly interesting. "He is trying to understand her," Sadie said, watching her son. "He will," Isaiah said. "He has your attention span." "He has yours," she said. "He looks at things the way you do, like he is planning how to build it." Isaiah looked at his son looking at his daughter, and felt the generational resonance of that observation in his chest. The years that followed were the years of building, not just the fence and not just the house, but the fuller thing, the accumulated fabric of a life and a family and a place. Gerald started school in Colorado Crossing at age 6, walking the 1.5 miles to town in the mornings with the earnest purposefulness of his character, and Sadie taught him to read before that from her own collection of books, which had grown considerably since the single battered poetry volume on the windowsill. Isaiah taught him to drive a fence post at age 8, with the careful attention that a man pays when he is transmitting not just a skill but a philosophy, his father's philosophy and now his own, that a man who can build something that lasts can always find honest work. Clara was a different kind of child than her brother, louder and more mercurial and possessed of opinions about everything from the age of 2, which delighted her father entirely, and which her mother regarded with the particular mixture of recognition and amusement that came from seeing yourself in someone else. The cattle operation continued to grow steadily, managed with the joint intelligence of Isaiah's building and maintenance skills and Sadie's deep knowledge of the land and the animals. They added another 10 acres in 1889, when the adjacent parcel came available from a homesteader who was moving north, and Isaiah spent the better part of that fall extending the fence to encompass the new acreage, which gave him a particular and circular satisfaction. Hargrove wrote from Prescott in 1890 that the Territorial Land Commission case against historical vein practices had concluded with a formal censure of his former business practices, a largely symbolic outcome but a documented one, the kind of thing that went into the official record and stayed there. Sadie put the letter in the box where she kept important documents, the property deed and the loan repayment receipt and Gerald's birth record and Clara's, and the warrant vacation from New Mexico, and the original survey documents from Pell, all the paper architecture of the life they had built. On a December evening in 1890, 7 years after Isaiah had first ridden up the trail to the Bancroft property, and seen a woman in a work apron coming to meet him with green eyes that read everything, he sat at the kitchen table with her while Gerald did his school work at one end of the table and Clara drew horses in her drawing book at the other end, and the fire in the new fireplace was going well, and there was coffee, and the lamp was bright. Sadie was reading. He was reviewing some notes about the spring fence repair needs. It was a completely ordinary evening, and it was also, in the way of completely ordinary evenings that are only recognized for what they are years later, perfect. "Isaiah," she said, not looking up from her book. "Yes. Are you content?" He looked up from his notes. Gerald was writing something with the focused frown of a child doing arithmetic. Clara had drawn a horse that looked more like a dog but with conviction. The fire was warm. His wife's hair was in a loose braid over her shoulder and the lamplight was in it. "I am content," he said. He meant it with every specific part of himself. She looked up at him then, with the direct green regard that had been reading him truthfully since the first day. "Good," she said, and went back to her book. Outside the 40 acres, the desert night lay still and cold and vast, and the cedar fence stood in the darkness exactly where it had always stood, solid and permanent, marking the edge of the world and the beginning of what was theirs. He had built the fence she asked for, and she had asked him to build a life inside it. He had built that too, and it was the finest thing he had ever made.